Okay. Hello. Hello. I think we should get going. Okay, I think there are, for those caught in the corridor, there are still one or two seats, and we might as well now use up the front seats over here. Are there one or two at the back over there? Are there? Yes? There are one or two seats. Do you want to? Okay, I just want to observe that if you think education involves, in a way that's never put in the literature, an identification with the teacher, and then I do think that this evening we have very strong evidence of that. I was thinking about 2 or 3 minutes before 6, I'd never seen an audience that was A, so early, and B, so quiet. And, how are we to interpret this very early and quiet audience? It seems to me only by thinking that unconsciously they have made an enormous identification with their teacher, Theo Spyropoulos, who is to lecture this evening. I think it's a very considerable, in my view, tribute to his role both in the AA in general and the DRL in particular. As he himself said yesterday, introducing Greg, there was hardly any need to introduce him. And if that were true of Greg, it's even more true of Theo. He is, of course, as you know, and as many of you here experience, director of the DRL. He's also a visiting research fellow at the MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies. It always makes you think, no one ever has a unit like, the Center for Fairly Basic Visual Studies or something. They're always in America advanced. He's taught at the University of Pennsylvania and in London at the RCA in the Innovation, Design and Engineering department. And he directs the Experimental Architecture and Design studio, Minima Forms, with his own brother, Stefan. I would like you to welcome Theo, if you can welcome someone already here, to give this evening's lecture, after which he said he's happy to take questions. I'd like you to welcome Theo.
Not sure I'm so deserving of that introduction from Mark, but in many ways I'm obviously very humbled to speak about the work that I've been doing with the students, particularly as the nature of inquiry has not always been kind of clear, but in a certain way the students and my colleagues and so forth have kind of tried to explore alternative ways of thinking about things, and in doing so, problematize, I think, pretty much our daily existence in the graduate school design research lab, which I've had the pleasure of being involved in now for 12 years. Over those 12 years, we've tried to explore a different series of questions. One in particularly that, if I could speak very personally, troubled me quite a lot was something called parametric urbanism. It was something that was kind of unfamiliar because the notion of scale was something at a magnitude which didn't necessarily resonate with the ways that I was comfortable with. But as we were exploring that between our colleagues, such as Patrick Schumacher, Tom Verabas at the time, Yusuke Obuchi, we thought it was important, as we saw a lot of our colleagues were being asked to design cities as if they were buildings. And with that, we sort of tried to set up a thesis. The thesis was really about what the involvement of computation would have to a problem like architecture and urbanism. With that, I set up an agenda that I was calling Adaptive Ecologies. It was very much a part of a certain attitude which had a history as an evolving experiment, in particular since the conversation kicked off yesterday about issues of the digital and so forth. I really wasn't that interested in the period of the 80s and 90s. I had a strong affinity to the 50s, 60s, and 70s with a certain mindset about computation, which, to be honest with you, never really fully had the access that we had in terms of computation, but in a way that was a certain optimism, a social engagement, and problematizing of what-if scenarios. At the time, they were calling them thought experiments, in terms of how that could potentially foster a new way of thinking about architecture, change the relationship between the architect and the idea of the city. And what I'll try to organize a little bit today's talk around is this issue of computational urbanism, something that is driven really through ideas of in-betweenness. My background, in some sense, has been influenced, I guess, a lot with the kinds of work that I do with my brother, which always had fostered a kind of new way of thinking about communication and interaction. And through that, I discovered a whole series of researchers, experiments, computationally, biologically computational groups that were going on at IIT, Architecture Machine Group at MIT, and all of that started to serve as a precedence for the book. I thought today I would try not to explain too much about the book itself, but really the generators that were really a part of it. So if you excuse me, I'm going to show a couple of slides just to understand how I thought of the book in a certain way, which was really about a period of work that we did between 2004 and 2009. As part of the book, it was kind of important for me to invite people to sort of discuss things. Some moment in time, I was basically told that you should invite your friends and your enemies to contribute to the conversation. And with that, I was quite humbled by the kinds of conversations that the idea of the book came up with, and particularly with someone named John Henry Holland, who is really the father of kind of adaptive systems and evolutionary algorithmic processes. The conversations with him for his seminal sort of writings on these adaptive systems were really influential in the studio. And at the same time, also were people like Patrick Schumacher, who had a very different idea of what his role in terms of parametricism would be. If he was looking at it from a very particular angle, I was looking at it from the opposite one. With mutual respect and, let's say, creative friction, a lot of things were teased out over the 4 years, which I thought were really important. At the same time, you had people in the school like John Fraser, who was working and evolving a lot of these kind of experiments throughout the 80s and 90s. Brett contributed to it, but also people like David Rue, who was a young architect, heavily influenced by object-oriented ontologies and so forth. And people working in Asia at the time in the 90s, like Makoto Sei Watanabe, who for many people maybe don't know, but he was really one of the other Japanese architects, aside from Shoyu, that Greg mentioned, that was really trying to push algorithmic design processes. So with that, people like Mark Burry and a whole series of other people contributed to the book, and I think the book in some way holds those different sort of discursive issues in some sense within this idea of the generative. For me anyway, I thought that a generative approach is basically what we could do to sort of evolve the kind of conversations that were so seminal, I think, particularly in the late 60s and 70s. The idea of what constituted an architecture machine was also something that was very important to me. Reconsidering, let's say, these seminal utopian projects and megastructural projects that were so influential to many of us who studied in places like this, people like Rainer Banham, and a whole host of other people that were talking about issues like urban futures, very similar to the way Greg was talking about it within a kind of recent past. At the same time, I guess the nature of the research always kind of spawned a certain attitude to speculative understanding or forecasting, and something like in 1913's cover of Scientific American, you start to see that there was a desire anyway to really think about the city as a spatially organized infrastructure of mobility, living, and a whole series of other desires and attributes that were very, very much a part of the everyday. In a strange way, the question of a lot of those projects sort of unfolded in a way that we say, well, utopia, this was a kind of project that never materialized. But one could make the argument that the megastructural project with that scale of magnitude has been realized, but maybe not with that vision and clarity of a kind of general sense of purpose. We see these kind of cookie-cutter architecture being masqueraded and paraded all through Asia, all through the Emirates, all through the States. It's symptomatic of a certain attitude towards the generic. And maybe one of the things that I was trying to articulate in some way was that there were opportunities to think about different sort of models that were time-based, that particularly dealt with a certain latency and also a certain uncertainty. What I present in the book with the students' work is not a definition of a new or the next thing. It's an alternative that basically was based on a series of projects like Yona Friedman's Flatrider or Negroponte's research with his architecture machine group. They were talking about a certain attitude that also was looking at a series of different scales, but started primarily with the notion of a unit. Some people call it a pod, a cell. You'll see that the language for me isn't really that important, but the description in terms of how they constituted certain ideas of orders of organization are. This slide is kind of like my new favorite one. I got it actually from John Fraser when we were going to do, well, when we did a symposium, and unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. But he gave it to me because in a certain way it seems like this idea of a continuous experiment, I think, really lives on. And I think there's a certain optimism in places like this which allow a kind of idea of research to actually be fostered. So in many ways these are not necessarily my ideas, let's call it our ideas within a particular sort of trajectory in time. For him in particular, he was really very much engaged with a certain idea of evolution. He shares the same affinity, let's say, with people like John Henry Holland. He had the pleasure of working with people like Cedric Price and Gordon Pask, ideas that were really fostered from a very different kind of conversation with the city, and basically looking for a certain attitude towards a participatory architecture. So my objective anyway in terms of discussing this lecture anyhow sort of takes a cue of a lecture that Korb did in 1924, where he sort of threw up basically his references, in which in a certain way became the basis of an articulated document in itself. Within MIT, aside from the architecture machine group, Grigory Kepish is someone that I actually quite admire, mostly because I think he had a certain attitude, particularly when he founded the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, that aside from just looking at art, he also brought figures like Buckminster Fuller and Norbert Wiener and all of these people together. And in a certain way, I think, started to really open up a certain attitude that had no real disciplinary boundary, which is something that I think is quite important. But the argument, I guess, for what is today a part of this conversation, I think, is really to move beyond a certain attitude of the computational or the digital as something that's very generic, and to really start to understand that there are within those frameworks radically different ideas and notions behind how one will operate within things that we call generative, behavioral, parametric, or analog forms of computation. And our contemporary world obviously has very different ways in which we actually look and understand information. For me, particularly, it's one of discovery and curiosity in terms of how everyday elements of our life are basically being embedded with a different way of thinking, seeing, and doing. So for example, this is two cleaners, like the Roomba that you would buy, that have two different ways of sort of mapping and cleaning your house, robotic, basically, vacuum cleaners when you're not there. The idea of creating a new concept of search space and performance and decision-making are things that not necessarily are kind of given over to, let's say, the individual, but in a certain way have a certain collective or emergent property to them. Simple algorithms themselves are basically being asked today to do tasks. We know about search engines and all of these things. This is a very simple theorem, which is called the infinite monkey theorem, which is not a smart thing at all, but is recursively working through iterations. And as things are computing and as things are sort of evolving, we find different ways of actually dealing with certain problems. This one in depicting, let's say, the Mona Lisa. The same algorithm could be given a different kind of task, and in this task particularly, it's about playing Super Mario Brothers and adjusting to a very particular environment. For me, architecture and environment in some way is interchangeable. In the mid-60s, there was a conversation that was kicked off yesterday by the CCA in terms of sort of cataloging the machines that people were using, kind of identifying the notion of tools and mediums. I think it's pretty obvious that there's an influence between the tools and the mediums, but the nature of the work itself is not necessarily guided by that or the decision-making of that. But at MIT in particular, there was a very, let's say, deliberate way of looking at computation, much more from an idea of looking at what we could do with CAD systems and how we could foster a certain attitude towards the architect. Some people called it anti-architect, but I think in some way it was a different idea of discovery. At the same time, in this period, you have people actually problematizing the whole concept of art and technology and that relationship between science and practice. And so I mentioned yesterday the Institute of Contemporary Art's Cybernetic Serendipity show. It was really a platform just to bring work and to allow work to sort of speak and create and foster relationships between. I think the way that we construct and observe obviously starts to define a very particular kind of project, and with that, a particular sensibility that gives us a certain form of knowledge that we can operate. Here, for example, Charles and Ray Eames are starting to actually outline some of their first scenes of Powers of 10, which is also a quite seminal, obviously, short film in its own right. Today we have certain aspects of thinking about seeing things, and for example, this is Google's attempt of making an autonomous car. The autonomous car has its own way of seeing, some which is local and some which is global. So it uses things like GPS to give us overall ideas and identification with an environment and local responses within a certain proximity to respond to that. And I think this one is actually basically what I would consider a kind of model for, let's say, my attitude towards a lot of the computational logics, which is not really a top-down or a bottom-up system. It's really trying to identify certain correlations, and maybe that's why I called the book correlated systems of interaction. But for example, a lot of things that we were looking at, particularly as models for this, were looking at almost animalistic-like principles. So for example, how a termite mound would actually start to create a whole logic of stigmergic relationships, how over time that sensibility and adjustment, for example, where the, let's call it the queen royal chamber, would be continuously adjusting as the building process would actually be part of this. You can see this also in the way that we try to understand how these processes are operating. So for example, we have these 3D cubic descriptions of a hexagonal packing that wasps are basically doing to create their own environment.
But these creatures are the result of an astounding new idea that may
In
soon
the
take us
90s,
from the dog
I
level
think this was
to
one of the more
superintelligence.
interesting experiments done
Robots
by
like
Carl
Clayton must
Sims
be programmed to
about
become
evolving a
artificial,
certain
but
attitude
not these strange things.
that he was
They
creating as
created
creatures.
themselves through a
Creatures that
process
basically
called
didn't have a
artificial
primitive body
evolution.
plan to begin with, but had emerging properties that would set up relationships that would allow that to, over time, evolve. Sorry. Within the studio and in the practice, in the DRL, we've had a whole series of tutors that have been working on different kinds of relationships, but all of them have tried to use time as a very important factor in terms of a certain kind of discovery. We use algorithmic processes, we use different ways of trying to understand and build up relationships, and in a certain way try to foster a certain active dialogue with the digital tools today. They're not necessarily representational tools. What we're looking for is actually abilities to demonstrate and be in control of certain ideas of information. And the reasons for that, I think, are pretty explicitly clear, particularly when we move to the scale of urbanism. So if the project was really about looking in between scales, it was being generalized between a unit, a cluster, and a collective scale. And ideas of looking at time-based systems, agent-based systems, understanding different sort of patterns and different ideas of interaction and legitimacy within those interactions fostered different ideas of understanding. And a lot of that had certain analogous relationships with some of these animalistic tendencies. So for example, this is a diagram of looking at how ants work and the way that they actually recursively build their colonies. But in the same way, you'll see on the bottom left corner, you'll see a little X where two colonies have started to fight, literally fight, in terms of trying to sort of create, colonize, and sort of overtake different sort of habitual environments. Our version of this sort of takes a key of people like John Conway. For example, he made up a simple game to try to explain some of these complexities.
The simulation consists of a grid, a bit like a chessboard, extending infinitely in all directions. Each square of the grid can either be lit up, which he called alive, or dark, which he called dead. Whether a given square is dead or alive depends on what is happening in the 8 other squares that surround it. For example, if a living square like this one has no living squares nearby, the rules say it will die of loneliness. If a living square is surrounded by more than 3 other living squares, the square will also die of overcrowding. But if a dead square is surrounded by 3 living squares, it becomes lit, or is born. Once you set an initial state of living squares and let the simulation run, these simple laws determine what happens in the future. The results are surprising. As the program progresses, shapes appear and disappear spontaneously. Collections of shapes move across the grid, bouncing off one another. There are whole kinds of objects, species, that interact. Some can even reproduce, just as life does in the real world. These complex properties emerge from simple laws that contain no concepts like movement or reproduction. It's possible to imagine that something like the game of life, with only a few basic laws, might produce highly complex features. Perhaps even intelligence. It might take a grid with many billions of squares, but that's not surprising. We have many hundreds of billions of cells in our brains.
Okay, that was a bit dramatic, but I think the importance about it all is I think we are dealing with certain problems that in many ways we try to find the root of their sort of engagement. We try to do diagrams like this that try to be explicit about the forms of engagements that we deal with. In the 90s, the diagrammatic process, the dynamic diagram and so forth, all of those things were still sort of operating within the domain of the representational. What we're finding, I think, particularly now with certain forms of computation, is that populations matter. And populations and computational power or prowess gives us the opportunity to make things actually much more tangible in some way. To take simple systems like this, for example, that could also be not within the domain of the digital, but could be actually worked on in physical and sort of dynamic systems in prototypes that would actually give us a different form of discovery. So within the studio, we've been working on a series of a lot of these kind of problems, and if you look at particular so-called recent past, you look at diagrams like this of Gordon Pask, who was trying to really look and examine at certain relationships that he was developing with the Fun Palace and a series of other things. Pask in particular is an interesting person for me because he fostered a certain idea of participatory engagement. He was working both on the British side and, let's call it the Boston side, at MIT, developing certain ideas of this. And it had a particular influence, I think, with people like Nicholas Negroponte, because in his world, he was also looking at a certain form of participation. These are some of his models about what a genetic deployment or a participatory model of urbanism could potentially work on at the scale of housing logic. Now, to sort of suggest that these are all basically friends because they're working digitally, we could potentially call Leon Krier an enemy, but not necessarily for the reasons that we would think. Mostly because of the attitude that potentially sort of petrifies a certain relationship to the past as being basically a way to deal with the future. And in many ways, I find that there's a kind of sensibility within those 60s and 70s, which I think were really important and resonated, which people like McLuhan would say, if you're interested in the future, look to the present because we live in the past. And in a certain sense, this kind of attitude towards building is not necessarily one that I share. But when you start to look deeper, and I think a big part of the conversation means to actually have a conversation about it, you start to realize that the same terms of engagement that everybody has to deal with as an architectural problem is demanded of all sort of attributes and all sort of agendas towards this. So topology, ideas of an urban block, concepts that we were using in the studio in terms of a seeding logic or cities within cities, ideas of notionally organizing clusters of organizations to start to develop a different logic of boundaries. You could see a lot of those certain terminologies within the adaptive systems of John Holland, where boundaries and signals were really important, and you start to recognize those things in the diagrammatic processes even of Leon Krier, because Leon Krier, like Christopher Alexander and a lot of people, were basically looking for ways of organizing and dealing with the issues of the city. Within the DRL, Frei Otto is a bit of a rock star for us, but just like for many other people. But he was also someone that was quite forgotten during a very big period of time, which unfortunately that's how cyclical our generations are with work. but the research still remains very seminal, and within our students' work, we do our own versions using digital technologies to explore some of those complexities. But I think the thing that is really to start to look at is what the medium of time actually gives us. The notion that things are really stable or come into certain form or formation at a moment in time. And that these relationships are not fixed, that sometimes the print media sort of give it with very deterministic ways and attitudes of thinking, but are obviously things that are actually held together with very particular relationships. The way that we worked a lot on the problems was really not necessarily through analogies towards nature and termite mounds and so forth. On the other hand, we were looking at how materials organize themselves, particularly some of these kind of experiments that we were using, viscous fluids and plates, exploring Healy-Shaw patterns and different ways of networking and organization. You'll see that there's a tendency to think about a seated logic. It was kind of, let's say, after 4 years of experimenting, a particular attitude towards dealing with certain kinds of organizational principles, understanding where hierarchy could emerge, not as something that was prescriptive, but something that was emergent, and trying to use computational and diagrammatic processes to be able to have a certain form of discovery, to understand basically how these things were actually being developed, and to understand the relationships that could potentially give us a different way of looking at everyday problems. So this group of students were working with space syntax and people like Bill Hillier, trying to create a way to evaluate this. How could one bring an analytical way to actually deal with information? And for example, where you started to deal with different kind of nodal output, the relationship or the evaluation of that node, or let's say potentially what would be a high street, was born out of it as a networked organization. And those led us to sort of propose alternative models to things that were going on at the time. For example, the Shanghai Expo, which had a concept of better city, better life, but didn't necessarily have a post, let's say, Expo plan, which, to be honest, complexities of that wouldn't render itself in 2.5 years as they were thinking. So this idea of the house, I think in many ways, is something that we're questioning, in particular this notion of the unit as a deploying system. In the book, we try to organize a series of different ideas, cataloging them through time, as early as 1920s, as late as 2010. This kind of combinatorial logic was something that was very much a part of how we were exploring some of these ideas. These are experiments that were done not by us, but in the same show that I was mentioning, Cybernetic Serendipity. In the studio, we have different versions of those things, but they still sort of operate within particular demands the same. Experimentation and research is basically the way that we are dealing with a lot of that stuff. But I do think it is to sort of create a certain logic or a framework. And I do believe it's for the pursuit of novel material and social forms of systemic interaction. So the way that we started to sort of deal with these projects, which, let's say, what we generally typify as research within the course, is over a 3 to 4 year period of time. You can imagine that we have anywhere between 3 to 4 teams per year. We're looking at 12 to 15 teams, let's say, between what we call a research cycle. And through that, try to organize a certain logic of a taxonomy. This one was very much born out of a certain kind of computational relationship that took certain attitudes of self-organization, morphogenetic processes, and behavioral processes as key, let's say, clustering and organizing ways of thinking about some of these projects. The morphogenetic, looking at everything from mangle processes, to polyp growth, colonial forms, phyllotaxis, to what we were calling self-organizational, stigmergy, operational detour networks, cellular automata, and to behavioral properties like surface tension models, Healy-Shaw cells, siphonophores, somatics, and so forth. People like Claude Shannon played a very important role for us as well. He developed not only very important systems theory and information theory in mathematics, but he also created these kind of experiments. We could call them maverick in the way that they were sort of outlined, but for example, this is a mechanical mouse that has the ability to solve problems like maze finding. These things within the studio are kind of important because we start to deal with computational processes that, as I was mentioning before, are very time-based and are dealing with high population. So the criteria that we use to assess this is always, in a certain sense, a kind of hybrid. And within the digital platforms, we start to work within frameworks. We can actually start to cross-pollinate certain kind of known features within the genetic. So for example, stigmergy driven through agent processes could be something that could give us a certain attitude, not necessarily only as an organizational element, but potentially also looking at the termites as ways of actually dealing with depositional strategies of making, sort of tying into a lot of the material processes that we're looking at within CNC logics and so forth. So we try to find different ways to map these things, to deal with time-based logics, to start to deal with the environment and the organization as a playpen, which actually has different sort of logics of computation. And a lot of that computation is being driven by certain ways that are analytical and descriptive in a certain way. So a lot of agent-based logic is used to explain characteristics of schools of fish, swarms, and so forth. Those things are very well known. But at some level, what the implications are of those kind of systems to problems like this is something that's slightly unknown. We can sort of overanalyze why some of these social experiments have failed, and I think we always hear historians sort of talk about the history of failures. But to be honest with you, I don't necessarily think that the problem is so simplistic. I don't think that one can look at someone like Philip Johnson at a similar time in the late 70s and say that he was, let's say, the depiction of what an architect was. This is the same time of Cedric Price or Negroponte. So even this idea of thinking about the architect as a singular figure in any capacity and identifying with it is something that, to be honest with you, I don't really share much of an interest in. Neither is a certain kind of attitude that holistically talks about identity, iconic, and these also very trivializing and caricature terms that we use to describe architects today. We speak about people almost as they are pop stars, but they're not. And in some way, in the days of not so far past, we talked about them as masters, people that actually had a certain amount of knowledge, and with that, a certain kind of respect in terms of how people are looking at the problems. We looked at different kinds of sites, like, for example, Hudson Yards in New York, which after a very long period of time is now seemingly going forward, but not, let's say, with the same kind of diversity and range like when the CCA had a competition that looked at people like UN Studio and Eisenman and Jesse Reiser, and all of these people coming up with different ideas. We saw that same failure, what's happening down at Ground Zero in New York, where lots of architects were brought together somehow to operate and to give ideas forward, but at the end of the day, rendered in a way where all that conversation didn't give over, let's say, to a new form of architecture or a new opportunity for design. So I go back to some of these examples, not with a kind of romanticism, but actually with a certain general statement of purpose, which looks at some of the problems which are beyond, let's say, the individual's capacity, that looked for a certain partnership within computation, the architect, so forth. So ideas of the generator or the generative are things that we are very interested in. The ideas of how we organize space over time is also something that I think is very critical. And so within the studio, we try to develop kind of systems to think about different scales. One of the things that I think is really important is that computation gives us a certain level of abstraction. The scales still make the same demands that they would make of any architect, but the idea, or at least the thesis, is that computational principles embed at a certain level a kind of principal feature that we can data mine, explore, and sort of push forward a different series of questions towards it. That's not to suggest that it is basically a solution in itself. but it is to suggest that it actually refigures a certain attitude towards the concept of master planning, which for the longest period of time in terms of urban development and city development, we've sort of hanged our hat on the notion of a master plan as being a way, a blueprint for what a city could be. We've never seen that blueprint anyway fully realized, and many people think that's a good thing, and I agree. But at the same time, the vision should be something that is maintained but evolved. And I think computation allows us a certain access at least to the problem. So for example, Yona Friedman had very particular diagrams that talk about the relationship between flats, a different attitude towards a community that would be localized. The metabolists who we looked at as being a sort of group in particular that was dealing with a whole host of questions, it's not with that kind of, let's say, utopian reaction that we had a lot within the European context. It was really with projects that were really being demanded of many architects like Kenzo Tange, Kurokawa, Kikutaki, and so forth. Something like the Tokyo Bay experiment of Kenzo Tange was something for 8 million people. And so those kind of questions are really important, and when you start to think about the visions that were underlying some of those recent pasts, this is, for example, a housing project of Uchida in 1933, who was basically trying to develop a housing scheme for 200,000 farmers. These kind of ideas you would find, let's say, in Broadacre City of Frank Lloyd Wright. But at the same time, we were talking about a certain magnitude. Let's say the problem was sort of describing a certain magnitude that really needed to propose alternatives. The expo, for example, in Osaka, I think becomes an interesting experiment in itself, where a series of different kinds of models, a lot of the things that were being talked about, let's say by Yona Friedman and others like Archigram, were being tested, and they were being master planned by Kenzo Tange himself, which I think is a really important figure. And a lot of the things that we were doing within the adaptive ecologies argument. But at the same time, there was a certain playfulness within the expo. These are robots that were parading around, 20-meter robots that were really interacting with the general public, along with, let's say, the Swiss Pavilion, which if you've been to the Serpentine recently, you can say is the long-lost grandfather. These expo ropeways and a whole series of different ideas of infrastructure movement, a lot of the attitudes that even people like Frederick Price and so forth were arguing for, found a certain manifestation, not in a model, but in the reality of the expo, which really made the problem something for the everyday, which I also think is something that's very important. The conversation, because of its experimental realization, fostered a different idea of potential futures, and a lot of the testing that was done was about alternative ideas of living or housing. So Kikutaki's towers. This picture for me is actually pretty interesting because you have people like Dennis Crompton and Moshe Safdie, Yona Friedman coming to the expo, experiencing this thing as well. And you start to understand that there was a different kind of dialogue and conversation between people, which we may take for granted now because of our easily accessible ideas of information. But then it was a slightly different period of time. And so if we had Archigram, that conversation became Osakagram. And the discussions, the idea of performance, the notion of an event architecture was all part of an idea that was for the everyday. It was part spectacle, it was part problem solving, and I think in many ways actually started to really talk about an alternative idea of thinking about the house. We know that a lot of the metabolist projects had certain problems, but that wasn't necessarily a problem of design, more an attitude towards architecture, I would argue. When you start to look at the notion that drives a lot of the computational work from component designs and so forth, you'll start to see that that sensibility was not something that was born from the computer, but was obviously something that's been evolved and evolving for a long time. And the scales and the magnitude of some of these research experiments demonstrated something different, where Yona Friedman's world or Constant's world was actually given a certain form and legibility. But for many people, I guess, within the urban context, this was the context in which we were working at. If the expo was a tabula rasa as a playpen for experimentation, what we're given for many ideas of future city development is an idea of really a tabula rasa where context specificity doesn't matter. When you look at certain people historically that have talked about alternative models, you look at people like Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think what's striking about things like Broadacre City and so forth was as much the attention to the mobility of that demand, for example, in these quasi-flying helicopter-like systems, or his rethinking or his attention of the vehicle. You could argue that's the single occupancy vehicle of Broadacre City, a version of the Google car. Instead of that, we get this, which, to be honest with you, it's easy to state that this is the given. It's really difficult to propose alternatives. And one of the demands that this gives is actually how we can respond within a very particular time frame, and how we can deal with the complexities of not only the developers, the contractors, the idea of multiple programming, reprogramming, in a way to change and reshape what the urbanism actually is. So if Archism was kind of talking about a different ideal of the city that was driven by the car, we're not talking about Detroit, and for sure we're not talking about Houston, which is a manifestation of what car architecture has given us. Super Studio was sort of glorifying the notion of the highway or the interstate. I guess what we're sort of arguing for today is that we've learned from some of these experiments, and we are trying, at least in some way, to foster a different kind of conversation and what I would call collective design. I speak really briefly about Negroponte and the Architecture Machine Group because I think it's a pretty important one, but I'm mindful it's Friday and you guys probably have a lot better things to do. Negroponte, I think, is a really important figure, mostly because he may have started the experiment really to play around with CAD systems and to really start to see what, let's say, this would do for the architectural practice in the 60s. But it started to foster radical experiments over the 10 years, let's say, of its kind of holistic organization. Something like the Architecture Machine Group turned into MIT's Media Lab. And so this whole notion of many of these architects and visionaries, which started with the idea of architecture and moved towards communication, was obviously very much fostered by the actual technologies and the research themselves. From David Green to Nicholas Negroponte, there was a certain attitude of these kind of relationships and the notion of ephemeral, a reaction to sort of the modernist ideas. There was a relationship also with the students as a research context in which to develop work, which I think is really important. Let's say I'm speaking tonight as someone who was a participant in the work, not a single author, and to be honest, really spearheaded by the responses and reactions of the students. So in this case, for example, these were sugar cube models that Negroponte students were doing, actually rethinking certain forms of housing relationships. That manifested into certain projects like Seek, which was basically an environment for gerbils that would move around within these different automated systems that would reorganize based on simple alignment properties of all of the blocks that were being pushed around by the gerbils back onto grid. The fitness criteria over time gives you a certain understanding of potentially what a model like this could be for architecture. The architecture doesn't reside in the vitrine, it doesn't reside in this mechanical arm or the blocks or the gerbil. It's really this kind of notion of an ecology that we were kind of arguing for, and it's not necessarily a mechanical one. But certain relationships, and if you haven't looked at the books that the Architecture Machine Group has put out, I would encourage you to do so, because the notion of the laboratory, I think, was something that was very much fostered there as a way of really bridging the gap between the digital, the analog, the mechanical, and actually the social imperative. Some of the projects are more familiar from a kind of MIT technical logic, and some of them, when you look at them, would look like they happened in this building in the 60s. Things like half-naked Japanese women wearing wearables, endless grids, like Super Studio that would go out in a kind of digital landscape. These are all part of the products of actually that kind of shared sensibility. We've developed a series of different projects that were looking at different things, but part of that was really to rethink that kind of concept of organization, and also to look at the iterative process of design. One of the aspects of a lot of the work that's being shown here is not that there was a final proposal, but proposals. It was scenario-based, and though at times some of the work unfortunately gets privileged as a final, let's say, master plan, the power of the work was really about iterating different ideas, different logics and hybrid typologies, distribution systems, and the different ideas of seeding, of what that would do with the demands and the population, or the number of units that people were being asked to explain and to develop. So in this relationship, cellular automata was a way to distribute a series of housing units within the Shanghai Expo and to propose a series of different iterations. Iterations that potentially gave different solid-void relationships, different concepts of the ground, but in some way became tools, or at least mechanisms, to sort of tease out what really was potentially a way of rethinking some of these problems. Housing collectivity, let's say in Japan, even in the 70s, gave over projects like this, where Minoru Takayama in 1974 starts to really show the implications of some of the deep plans. It looks like a project that could be scripted and developed. To bring this to a close, because obviously it's super hot in here, especially for me right now with this chicken light. The three units, the three ideas of scale that I sort of want to really articulate was this idea of the unit of the house. And on the top left corner, you have something like Thomas Edison's single pore house. This idea of the house or the home, the design of the unit, always had a very important relationship to materiality. And it was something that, to be honest, within the 4 years that we did parametric urbanism, was something that we couldn't actually fully get a sense of. Some projects touched on it, but many didn't. And that sort of shaped, let's say, the 4 years after parametric urbanism that we were calling proto-design, that really tried to deal with those sort of material problems. But the problem of the house was always there. So Edison was working for a single pore house. We have people like Baruch Kushnevitz, who's trying to print a house in a day. We have a whole series of different attributes that give legibility. Our students at the time, Mustafa's group called Softcast, was developing a certain attitude towards looking at textiles and ways to deploy textiles as a system that could be comparable to Thomas Edison, but at the end of the day, still rendered the same problems of the problem of the architecture itself, the problem of a monomaterial kind of concept. And so one of the things that we try to do in the book is to sort of tease out a series of different strategies and create criteria, everything from dimensions, material, fabrication systems, of stuff like Richard and Sue Rogers' Zip House, which you could still see, I believe, till tomorrow, or Embryological House and so forth. But the one key figure that we use as a case study is Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller obviously is a quite famous guy for lightness and a series of other dome projects and so forth, but he had a very particular interest within the housing context. And organizationally, I think through his experience with the different sort of housing projects, which let's say we would organize around 4 very distinct housing proposals, you see the emergence of how a unit to unit could potentially interact, from a holistic individual unit to starting to develop a different kind of shape grammar, packing logic, to the idea of using shared silo kind of spaces in this house, and to the manifestation where the house could become a system for a tower, using the same strategies of lightness, which he was arguing a single family dwelling unit made in concrete and brick and mortar would weigh the same thing as basically his housing proposal on the left, taken by Zeppelin and dropped off in particular areas. The cluster building logic is a slightly different relationship. I think it's really the key scale of what we were working with. rethinking the notion of the individual unit as something holistic to something that was much more driven with a certain idea of community or social spaces around. So we have things like Allison and Peter Smithson's Robin Hood Gardens. We took 2 case studies for this to have a look at a little bit, and you can look at some of the diagrams, so forth. One was V. Hecker's Ramat housing, which was dealing with a certain idea of a almost component-like logic for unit deployment. And we paired that up, which you could see some of the drawings here and diagrams, and some of the construction logic, with Habitat of Moshe Safdie. And I think it's kind of important to also state that the architects gave over all of their material when it came to these buildings and all of their photographic resources. In many ways, because some of these certain ideas were still very much alive. And Moshe Safdie, when he came and spoke, you may have heard him speak about how influential Habitat is with a lot of series of developments that he's doing now. But this was a project of a 24-year-old kid, a kid who was given the opportunity to build a project, something that today's so-called climate would find ridiculously and appalling because we wouldn't have the experience to do something. It is one of the seminal housing models. And I think it just sort of echoes, at least for me, the power of youth and the ideas that are born out of that. Sometimes, let's say, with a naive optimism, but I think that's a good thing. The world is already pretty fucked up as it is, and it doesn't actually have solutions for everything. And I think there's a lot more openness to new ideas as long as you're willing to actually work through that. But the combinatorial logics of Safdie is also really interesting because one is not one, but one can be 3 or 2 with very different distributions. And you see what that means 3-dimensionally as a spatial driver. And architecture, I think, in many ways is really about those spatial relationships. We show some of these images of it being erected, put in place, still very much lived in and desirable as an environment. The last scale, anyway, was really the first target of the thesis, which was to rethink the logic of the master plan as something collective. If you look at the scale of the top left, Alan Bootwell basically made a proposal for a linear city. It's a different idea from, let's say, Dubai, but basically to connect New York to LA and San Francisco in one kind of solid urbanism that was extended and would actually house all of the infrastructure and pretty much everything else. On the bottom left is these Healy-Shaw experiments of our students, both arguing for a certain idea of continuousness, but in a radical different way. And mentioning that some of our colleagues were being asked to design cities as if they were buildings. Zaha and Patrick were being asked in 2001 to actually develop a master plan in Singapore. It became, let's say, the featured image of what a parametric urbanism would be. And it actually set up a series of different problematics, which you could start to see in things like Richard Neutra's Rush House, and you could start to see in other things like Algiers' master plan of Corb and so forth. But the people that we wanted to highlight here was Shaniak, because he had a very particular interest between the individual unit and the so-called collective and public space. He's not that well known, but the Frack Center basically owns pretty much everything the guy's done, from models to drawings, and you start to see a shared language of the mobility of a deployment system. At a certain logic of basically what would constitute a form of variable differentiation in terms of urban blocks and streets. And we tried to show that within the sections and the plans that we tried to redraw. These are models of Shaniak himself. And the other person that we sort of tried to engage a conversation with was Kikutaki. Kikutaki developed a whole series of ocean cities, very much talking about a new kind of urbanism, piloted and influenced a lot by things like Tokyo Bay, Kenzo Tangi, and so forth. But you start to see a certain sensibility of how he thinks this thing will evolve over time, a certain attitude of developing the individual unit within the collective. And I try to leave you, let's say, with one example of a certain kind of catchphrase, let's say, that Negroponte was using at the beginning of the architecture machine group, which I still think resonates today. And for him anyway, he says that he was going to treat the problem as an intimate association of two dissimilar species, man and machine, two dissimilar processes, design and computation, and two intelligent systems, the architect and the architecture machine. He continues by basically saying that he wants to see the physical environment as an evolving organism as opposed to a designed artifact. In particular, I should consider an evolution aided by specific class of machines. Warren McCullough calls them ethical robots. In the context of architecture, I should call them architectural machines. If this was the beginning of certain form of computation within architecture and research practice, I still feel that these words resonate today. With that, maybe I will just bring this one to a close. If there's any questions, I would happily answer them. Okay? Thanks.
Okay, there should be a mic somewhere. Yeah, here. Who has a question?
In the panel part of adaptive ecologies, you evidence some of the problems that this kind of architectural system find to translate in a bit architecture. But we think that because some of the problems sometimes are both political and also economical, do you think that using contemporary technologies like the 3D printing house developed by people like Rigodini, Shape, could bring this system to become a daily solution in the next years? Or there are also other difficulties that not lead to this system to become a daily solution?
Yeah, I don't think the manufacturing itself is a problem. Like, I think the architectural problem has been there historically. It's just been problematized to a really accelerated degree based on the time of development. And so when I said that parametric urbanism, let's say, caused for me personally a certain conflict, I think it was a very important one to recognize, which is, it's not, let's say, for me anyway, for you to judge if you participate in this or not. I think architects have to engage in those kind of problems because they exist regardless. And the way that you try to do that, I think, should be empowered by the tools that you have today. So instead of sort of bringing back, let's say, arguments of the past without sort of really looking at the way that you could explore them further today, I think is a bit of a missed opportunity. So let's say when I'm showing these projects, I think they become ways to understand that those kind of problems have continued to exist. So if it's post-war Japan, if it's the last 10 years of development or the development that's still continuing, speed is something that we have to cope with, and also complexity. Big part of the problem of what we design is basically things that we feel we understand, and we meaning society, in terms of things that we value. We value speed, we value economics, we value cheap, and these, to be honest with you, have always been there. But I think when we start to deal with the magnitude that we're dealing with now, they cause a certain problem, where we're trying to sort of replicate features that are really not the features that we need to really explore. And I do think we need to sort of embed a certain kind of attitude in terms of dealing with time. Like, time is a factor that's basically a product of every sort of master planning urbanism strategy. What tools do we have beyond, let's say, drawing a finite fixed plan in a master planning sensibility that's really at our hands at the moment? And I don't think it's an issue of basically thinking that this is a problem of us now or somehow we're unique in terms of addressing it. But I think when you start to look at the series of these different projects, you realize that there is a legacy of exploring those questions, and then the question is, how do you participate in it? We thought to explore through computation some of those issues. I think for me personally, the idea of the master plan in a traditional sense is not as valid as we would like it to be. or at least the way governments deal with it, city developers, and so forth. I mean, I don't know where that undying trust in that form of communication is from. I know historically why it's there, but in more contemporary ways, I don't see it. And I feel that at least if we can deal with an iterative process where we can actually demonstrate scenarios, we can actually make more informed judgment in terms of the kinds of conversations we have, and also demonstrate why we're having those conversations. So it's not to trivialize the problem, it's really to embrace the complexity which architecture and urbanism has always demanded. It's just the way that we work on it, which is something that we try to speculate. We're not the only ones, I say it again, but we try to deal with it with a certain kind of idea of interaction and agency. And this is basically the manifestation of where we got to. I think the experiment obviously continues. The book is just a demonstration of some of that so that there's a shared medium to distribute that.
Okay, towards the back and then after that.
You've touched a little bit on ethics as part of the presentation. How do you go about feeding into that sort of ethics that a draft board architect would normally put into a process such as this and turn them into things that can be fed into a parametric process? Things like light or it not feeling oppressive or those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think because a major aspect of a lot of these urban systems that we were looking at, density was very much a driver for a lot of the criteria. So I didn't show a lot of the students' projects because I focused on that in a previous presentation, but things, for example, like philotactical relationships, ideas of basically developing different logics that were neighbor relationships would allow us to have a certain kind of access. For example, how deep can a plan be before it's inhumane, or how high a level. So computation would allow us to give us certain attitudes for distribution. And in those scenarios, and the reason that I highlighted the Healy-Shaw problem, which some students really grabbed onto that from the beginning and sought other knowledges to bring into it. Like, for example, looking at space syntax's work, basically for fire, exit, and access, and so forth, and sort of using that as a way, coupled within these generative systems as a way of creating a form of feedback between that. I think that there isn't really one way, but there's an acknowledgement that there are ways to deal with the magnitude of such a problem, as long as we actually change also our attitude towards planning. Because, for example, if all forms of planning have to sort of give a certain already assumed idea of how we relate to ground, or, for example, a certain logic of zoning that, is not just a step-back rule, we're not really going to be able to deal with some of those problems. And a lot of these problems were really highlighted with the fact of creating new cities. But the same is true, to be honest with you, when we do potentially infill buildings or clusters or, within existing cities. So I don't think the problem changes. I think the sensitivity and the drivers for it will always be there, but we have to sort of couple that with the magnitude of the problem. When we were looking in the final stage of the 4-year cycle in my studio of Tokyo Bay, and I told my students to deal with a number like 8 million. Aside from their computers having problems and all of this stuff, like we couldn't really deal with geometries, there was really the problem actually, how abstract is 8 million? What's the difference between 6 and 8? I mean, is there a difference? I mean, perceptually, you couldn't see that. 5.5 square kilometers, or let's say 50 square kilometers. So I think it's really about trying to develop a better understanding, and with that, a better way to also describe that to potential people that we would be working with. So in Shanghai, we had let's call it the luxury of talking with the Planning Institute of Tunji. I'm not sure if we were very influential, but at least we put on the table a certain approach. And I think that that's kind of an unsaid thing, but is a very important thing when it resides within a research platform, and particularly when it's coming from students. because it's not, let's say, burdened with the idea that I'm trying to get a job or try to master plan another city. It's really about fostering a different dialogue about what is urban, in that context, a better city, which was supposed to be a future cultural sector for Shanghai, and actually housing driven in terms of 3 landowners relative to that 5.5 square kilometer of space. So I think the kinds of conversations we have don't necessarily have to regulate this as student work, but really as proposals for alternatives. And maybe that's the only real purpose of me actually talking about work that we did from 2004 to 9 is not to talk about it that it's still relevant, it's just the problems never really changed.
Okay.
Thank you for the lecture today. I'm a master course student and studying sustainable environment.
Yes.
But I'm still curious about how you can deal with the microclimate in high-density urban areas, because these days, especially high-density urban areas, how we can deal with the wind and the humidity and something like that is very important. So actually, before today's lecture, I expected that I can hear the specific solutions about some kind of that.
Yeah.
So do you have any plan to collaborate with the kind of sustainable cities?
So you're one of CMOS's students, yes? Okay. So maybe some SED students should also work with DRL students and try to foster some of those problems together. Let's put it this way. I really don't believe in kind of specialist knowledge. I'm going to really be honest, within the domain of architects. I think that that's not basically what we do very well. What we do very well, as far as I can see, is basically look at general problems and try to find general solutions and communicate with specialists to allow us the opportunity to really drive home, let's say, a different environment or a different sensibility of the city. And I don't think that that just happens on the scale of a bespoke house. I think it happens at the scale of a city. Cities are being built today. I mean, we see these things that in the next 50 years, you're going to basically build the world over twice. Like, these are kind of forecasts. And I think, honestly, sustainability in itself, as a subject in itself, I think is not enough. Because, of course, we have to think about new ways of thinking, but it's also new ways of living. We have different ideas, different social constructs, different ideas of family, urban, a whole series of different issues, which, to be honest with you, at the heart of it is just a human problem. So if we sort of are able to manage some of that complexity better, at least we can ask better questions of actually what we can do with the things. And basically, what are the new sort of parameters that will drive, let's say, the future proper? Like, every architecture that we design right now is not going to just magically appear. There's a time frame in it, and in that, the world is really an unstable place, and it's going to change. So how do we address those changes? I mean, those are just certain issues that I think are there, but sustainability, for sure, is one of those things. But it would be nicer if we didn't treat it as one thing, and just think of it much more embedded within the way that we think about space and city and interaction. So we focused on housing because, to be honest with you, also, it's usually trivialized as the most boring architecture project, but which was basically the response I got from my students when I first proposed it. Are you serious? We're basically doing housing? I said, yes. I tried to make the argument, experimentation has happened at the scale of the house. They're like, yeah, the house, but you basically want us to do 300,000 units. Yeah? You know, the same problems they faced, I faced. So I'm basically stating that because it's obvious, but it's also unsaid, that it changes as soon as you start to deal with a certain relationship. I showed John Conway's Game of Life because it's pretty interesting how simple it is, but at the same time, how varied, how complex, and we could think about different ways, potentially, of looking at that.
Maybe can we take a last question? Perhaps we've already had it.
Okay, then if that's the case,
I hope you join with me in thanking Theo very much.
anyway, thanks everyone for coming. I know in the back the AA bookshop people have been patiently waiting. If anybody's interested in looking at the book, it's in the back corner.